Dearest revolutionaries, your grades have been updated in my grade book, which is not on Canvas. This is offline. Please feel free to email me for a detailed summary of where you're at right now. The final exam is also posted on the syllabus. Please watch this lecture, both for answers to one of the questions on that final exam and also for instructions. I hope you have wonderful holidays. Thank you for your time this semester. If you're interested in pursuing this content further, please join History 383 in the spring, Modern War. Historians summarize the period we've looked at in this class as the long 19th century. The long 19th century refers to the period between the American, French, and Haitian revolutions at the end of the 1700s and the First World War. And we think of this as a coherent period with certain things in common throughout. How do we summarize this period? As I've thought about the 19th century, it seems to me that the simplest story that we can tell briefly that is also true about this period, and maybe the most important story, is the massive increase in centralization and power of the state, of the new modern, efficient, revolutionary state, which claims legitimacy by representing people, does not claim legitimacy by arguing the divine right of kings. This process of the centralization and increase in power of modern governments is most visible when we think about some examples from the beginning of this period and then towards the middle of this period. It's a process that is aided through nationalism, the idea that each people should have a state that represents them. But what I noticed about the nationalism in this period and the way it's changing is that nationalist movements are successful in the 19th century over the long term, as long as they support a centralized, more powerful, and more efficient nation-state government. But nationalist movements in support of Republican, Democratic, bottom-up conceptions of government have tended to be crushed, and in comparison today, look much more utopian and remote than they did at the beginning of this period. If you want to defy the modern state, there is a window to do that at the very beginning of this period. But as time goes on, especially if we think about the present, defying the state becomes more and more difficult and almost impossible to conceive of. Let's just very briefly think about George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte. Both Washington and Napoleon, of course, are participating in revolutionary, defiant actions against powerful imperial governments. The British monarchy and its colonial project overseas in the Americas, and in France, of course, thinking about the absolutist monarchy, or at least the monarchy that was until right before the French Revolution an absolutist monarchy. In both places, in the French Revolution and the American colonies in their revolution, rebellion is often framed as rebellion against excessively powerful governments. Think about all the conversation about tyranny, and think about the list of justifications that Jefferson includes in the Declaration of Independence. He has all the things that George III has done to become a tyrant, essentially, to justify our revolution. Think about Washington's critiques of mercantilism, discussions of unfair taxation, right, and armies coming over to the colonies to enforce their will, tariffs, etc. Things that benefit the central state, the British government, but not the colony. And with Washington, we include, as almost part of his legend, that his power was reluctant. And most historians would argue, to some extent at least, that his best decision as a leader was to retire at a moment in which he did not probably need to, in which he could have exerted his will to gain more of a foothold over the government. In fact, there were people clamoring for him to do so. And instead, Washington retires, and based solely on his precedent of retiring after 2 terms. But no law until FDR, until the 1930s, American presidents retire after 2 terms that entire time, just based on his precedent. They called him the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a Roman who was given dictatorial power in Rome during a state of emergency, and when the emergency was over, he gave up his power and went back to the farm and picked up the plow again. Washington was our Cincinnatus. When we also think about Washington's farewell speech, where he warns Americans to beware of allowing the president, in particular the executive, to get a private standing army. That is the critique of absolutism that he leaves with us. And then you think about the comparison of Napoleon, right? Napoleon, who becomes an emperor only because the French Revolution happens. He never could have even made high military command unless the French Revolution happened, because he was not a noble. Remember that the revolution starts in that tennis court moment with debates over what the nation is. And you remember Abbé Sieyès' famous "What is the Third Estate" pamphlet, where he says the nation is composed of all productive citizens, and therefore the government, the government needs to represent those citizens. And so they create that National Assembly to represent the nation. The National Assembly, which decides that it is the legitimate lawmaking, governing body of the nation. Everyone else needs to get in line. But the bizarre thing about Napoleon, in the long run, is, like Washington, he becomes the executive power in the French Revolution. Basically constitutionally. His fame is descended from his military prowess. But the French Revolution, with its beginning in attacks on tyrannical state power, ultimately, when Napoleon declares himself emperor and creates the first empire of France, by this point, the consequence of the French Revolution has been the creation of a much more powerful central authority, a government that is much more powerful than the absolutist monarchs were. So we get this strange, bizarre transition from common sense, as common sense would have it. When Napoleon is finally defeated for the second time at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and he goes into his final exile, we have this moment in which Napoleon's empire ends, this French revolutionary sourced government ends, and the French transition back to a monarchy from the Bourbon family. But that same transition from Napoleon, the revolutionary government, to the monarchy of the Bourbons, it could also be described as a transition from a more centralized government to a less centralized government. And actually, the restoration of the monarchy with Louis the 18th and his brother Charles X afterwards actually relies more on ideas of public legitimacy and social contract governance than Napoleon did in his later reign. So the fact that you have a republic based on a social contract does not mean that the government gets less centralized. In fact, the major lesson of the French revolutions and all of the modern revolutions that come at its wake is that actually governments get more and more powerful after them, in part because they're based on public legitimacy, But that doesn't always mean that they have to be held to that standard after they're set up. Once you can argue that you are the representative of the people, and the people are all powerful, and the government is all powerful, and we saw that highlighted in that moment of the Reign of Terror. Let's think about the way in which nationalism, the movement for each people to have their own government, which represents them. Let's think about how that movement is transforming the West during this period. You will remember in 1848, all over Europe, there are these revolutions. Largely, these are revolutions that are liberal and nationalist. They're liberal in the classical sense, and that they're arguing, depending on the conditions in each country, for legal reform, for citizenship reform, for freedoms of speech and the press, for constitutions, probably most of all. But in some places that don't have countries, they're arguing for a country. They're arguing for a country that represents them. In the revolutions all over what we would today call Germany, as you can see, and the Austrian Empire, these are often the foremost concerns. Let us, who see ourselves as connected, have a state, a government that embodies that connection. If you remember thinking about the Austrian Empire, which becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the problem there is, if each people deserves a nation that represents them, how do you define people? Which groups get countries and which groups don't? In Austria-Hungary, there's an arbitrary line drawn. The two largest self-identified groups, the Hungarians and the Austrians, they become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But there's no reason for this except that that's the decision that was made by humans. In fact, all of these groupings are in some sense imagined. In the process of the formation of the modern country of Germany, there were many options in how Germany could turn out. There were lots of people that speak German outside of what will become Germany. Of course, in Belgium and in Switzerland and in Austria, there are German speakers. How did the borders of modern Germany become formed, if not by language? It was the effect of a modern, industrial, imperial state, Prussia, and the effects of 3 wars on that ended up creating the contours of Germany as they are more or less towards the present. The Third War between Germany and between Prussia and France ended literally as Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon, is defeated brutally in several battles, and Prussia ends in the hall of Versailles, the Versailles Palace, where the absolutist monarchs of France used to reign on high. Germany declares itself a country. In Italy, where there is no country up until the mid-1800s, there is a peninsula and lots of people who speak very different versions of what we might today call Italian. There is an industrial, powerful, centralized state. Even though it's a monarchy in Piedmont, Sardinia, it has an industrial revolution. And then there is the rest of the peninsula, which is profoundly rural, non-industrial. How does Italy become a state? It becomes a state by broad, bottom-up imagination and powerful top-down unilateral decision-making and a bunch of wars. In the United States, it is the process of a centralizing, increasing in power government spreading through the rest of the country that ends up creating the modern contours of what we call the United States of America. If you looked at westward expansion, or if you looked at the Civil War, one way to talk about both of those things is the expansion of the power of an industrial centralized state. Defining a nation is tricky, but one historian, Ernest Gellner, has attempted it this way. In fact, nations, like states, are a contingency and not a universal necessity. Contingency is something that could have gone a different way. Neither nations nor states exist at all times and in all circumstances. Moreover, nations and states are not the same contingency. Nationalism holds that they were destined for each other, that a group of people, a nation, deserves their own state, their own government. That either without the other is incomplete and constitutes a tragedy. But before they could become intended for each other, each of them had to emerge, and their emergence was independent and contingent. The state has certainly emerged without the help of a nation. Some nations have certainly emerged without the blessings of their own state. It is more debatable whether the normative idea of the nation, in the modern sense, did not presuppose the prior existence of the state. Normative means statements including should or ought. The problem Gellner is presenting us is everyone agrees and understands that the United States of America didn't exist at creation. This is a country that was made by decisions. But if it isn't something that's natural, if it was created, how did such vastly different groups of people over long periods of time come to imagine themselves as a group? In France, in the 1800s, more than 50% of the population didn't speak French. That was an effect of decisions that were made in the later 1800s. There's a famous historian named Benedict Anderson who talks about imagined communities, and this is basically what we're already talking about now. How do unconnected people begin to imagine themselves as a group? Well, these are also effects of industrializing, modernizing countries. State-sponsored universities, which require, and mandatory schooling across the nation, which require that everyone learns the same language, which often require, especially in the 1800s, that everyone learns the same history. Newspapers in the 1800s were, of course, mass distributed, but also much fewer options existed for getting your news than they do today, which meant that you might have a different newspaper than your neighbor based on your political affiliation, but you're all dealing with the same facts. Of course, that creates a community in a way. Markets that have regularized their currency all over a country begin to bring people together in new ways. Intellectuals that lead many of these movements begin to argue that there's a spiritual unity to country. And then symbols are really powerful when they're deployed in getting people to imagine themselves as a group. In Italy, the intellectual who is a romantic, a liberal, and a nationalist, who is most credited with being behind the foundation of a movement for Italian unification and creating a country called Italy, is Giuseppe Mazzini, and he writes, "In laboring according to true principles for our country, we are laboring for humanity. Our country is the fulcrum of the lever which we have to wield for the common good. If we give up this fulcrum, we run the risk of becoming useless to our country and to humanity. Before associating ourselves with the nations which compose humanity, we must exist as a nation." And in Mazzini's imagination, Italy could become something that it had always had the potential to become, a unified group of people, a nation, that would also be bringing into the community of nations, into the entire world, zeal for democracy, a zeal for freedom, and a romantic spiritual identity. You'll remember this painting by Caspar David Friedrich. These two figures with their Martin Luther hats, which were illegal because they were a sign of German nationalism when Germany was still a confederation. Napoleon had ended the Holy Roman Empire, but he'd left behind 30 small countries, basically called the German Confederation, all with different rules and coinage and government systems and laws. And romantic German nationalists, liberals in this period, they were desperate for something that was united, that brought Germany and Germans together under one set of laws, under one set of coins, under one set of symbols. When you're trying to mobilize a whole bunch of people who may be very different, when you're trying to get them to think of themselves as part of a group, you might draw on certain symbols that seem to have almost eternal value in mobilizing, especially young men to fight. One way to do this is to represent your country, your nation, as a woman, and then describe your enemies as doing violence against that woman. This is the British forcing tea down the throat of Columbia, the spirit of the United States. Here she is again. This is the spirit, the central figure in black is the spirit of Czechoslovakia at the time, which was being dominated by that person on the left. You can see with the white hat looking sternly is Bismarck, of what is going to become Germany, the Chancellor. Or look at this image depicting Germania, the spirit of Germany. You notice she's pregnant. Well, this is the 1820s or 30s. Germany doesn't exist. So Germania is waiting to give birth to a nation. You've all seen Marianne, the symbol of France, who also appears in New York Harbor as the Statue of Liberty. This is the depiction, the symbolic depiction of Greece as they, in 1830, rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. Depicting your country as a woman and then arguing that symbolically that your enemies are essentially involved in a rape is always been a good strategy to mobilize young men to passionately fight on behalf of that cause. Another way to generate enthusiasm for fighting on behalf of a nation together is to use religious language and symbols. Scenes of martyrdom, which have certain qualities as developed in the history of Christian art. For example, this the death of the great naval commander of the British who fought Napoleon, as he was shot by a sniper from an enemy ship. You can see very clearly here that this is not depicted as a normal death. This is the death of a saint and a martyr. Or I think these next three examples all come from the Italian movement. This killing of a partisan, and you can see that heaven is opening up to take him. The palm leaf is a symbol of martyrdom in Christian tradition. And then this figure here, who, if I asked you to guess who it was, with the wounds on his hand and the beatific face and the light behind his head, you wouldn't be foolish for assuming that this is Jesus Christ. But it is not. It is the Italian revolutionary figure, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Imagining that a group of people who do not know each other, who are separated by large amounts of distance and culture and perhaps language and history, imagining that group of people is that there is a one group that includes all those differences requires a lot of work, and industrial states put in the work to create those connections. Now I want to take two examples of revolutionary figures from the mid 1800s, and I want to watch as they struggle to achieve a bottom-up democratic Republican result in a career of hardship and countless activities. The first is Louis Auguste Blanqui, born 1805 and died 1881. He's nicknamed L'Enfermé which means the imprisoned or the incarcerated, because over half of his adult life was spent in jail. 43 years of his life was spent in jail. He believed in neither gods nor masters. That was one of his slogans. But his life proves in many ways who the masters were. He had a very close family when he was born. He had an incredibly loving mother. While studying law and medicine, Auguste witnessed the public execution of 4 members of the Carbonari, a secret underground anti-Bourbon movement in France. Watching them die on the scaffold, he learned to hate the society that would murder 4 good men to protect the powerful and the privileged, as he saw it. At the age of 19, in 1824, he joined the Carbonari, the secret society, and begins his political activities, his illegal political activities that he will be dedicated to for the rest of his life. In the late 1820s, the second French king after the Restoration, Charles X, tries to bring back some of the elements of the old regime, some of the elements of the divine right monarchy like existed in the Sun King's time. He passes a law, for example, that makes it a crime to commit any sort of sacrilege. And that same year that law was passed, 1825, Blanqui fell passionately in love with Amélie Suzanne Serre, a talented painter. She had a family who was conservative and middle class, and totally disapproved of this couple, of Blanqui in particular. But Amélie was in love, and eventually in 1834 they'll get married. Before that happens, while they're still in love but not yet married, in 1827, Blanqui is 22. He participates in his first street revolutionary action in Rue Saint-Denis in Paris, and he is shot in the neck but survives. And then 1830, July, that's called the July Revolution. The Bourbons are kicked out, and a new king is put in power, Louis Philippe. But this guy is the king of the French instead of the king of France, and he brings back constitutions and such. Blanqui is all over the barricades in July 1830. He will later claim that he was the first to bring a loaded rifle into the streets during these days. This is a 3-day revolution, basically. And the new king gave him an award, the Decoration of July, for his role being on the front lines of the revolution. But he's very soon going to become a brutal critic of this new monarch as well. And one author notes, quote, "This was the last award, aside from prison sentences, that he was ever to receive from the French government." He immediately created a new secret society called the Friends of the People, l'Ami du Peuple, and began resistance to the new monarchy. In 1832, 2 years later, Blanqui is put on trial for the first time, although it will certainly not be the last. As he's defending himself, he makes this totally unapologetic revolutionary speech, defying his judges, defending socialist principles. Blanqui will be a socialist his whole life, but never a Marxist, because he comes to socialism before Marx. He describes the situation during this trial in which the French are living in as a war, quote, between the rich and the poor. and says about himself, quote, "I am accused of having told 30 million French people, proletarians like me, that they had the right to live. As for our role, it is written in advance. The role of accuser is the only one appropriate for the oppressed." So he stands there to accuse the authorities. The public galleries after his speech break out into this long applause, and the gavel is being hammered down, and the judge says, orders quiet, and the jury acquits him. But the judge overrules the jury and condemns him for trying to, quote, "disturb the public peace by arousing the contempt and hatred of the citizenry against several classes of people which he has variously designated as the privileged rich, or the bourgeoisie." And in particular, the judge says he's being condemned for insisting that, quote, "the privileged live fat off the sweat of the poor." So he goes to prison for a year for one of his smallest prison sentences. In 1834, Blanqui and Amélie, his fiancée, get married. And the parents are outraged. They try to stop it, but they're not successful. They have one child named Estève, and a second son is born in 1835 but dies in childbirth. Blanqui will remain for his entire life a totally devoted husband, completely in love with his wife, and she supports him in all of his activities. The same year, Blanqui sets up a new secret society called the Families, a society organized in tiny cells or families. No minutes of the meetings were kept, and so we don't really know exactly what happened under the cover of secrecy. But all the members had to promise to fight for a social revolution. And what this begins to mean in the 1800s, a social revolution means a revolution that is not just fighting for rights, such as freedom of speech and religion and such, but also fighting for economic equality. By the summer of 1836, there are about 1,200 members in his secret society, mostly young, a lot of students and artisans, and some army officers and National Guardsmen as well. An informer ends up leading the police to a store of their weapons, ammunition, and membership lists. And so Blanqui gets hauled up back in court and is sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and is fined. And the police are going to follow him from this point, really basically to the rest of his life. He's let out of prison in 1837 and immediately begins doing the same thing. He sets up another secret society called the Seasons. And the vow that the Seasons took in private was this, quote, "In the name of the Republic, I swear eternal hatred to all kings, aristocrats, and all oppressors of humanity." It's during this period as well that Blanqui, while watching the way the Catholic Church in France supports the government in ways that he believes are tyrannical, Blanqui becomes devoted to anti-clericalism, and he becomes an atheist. In 1839, the leaders of the Seasons began stockpiling weapons, and they ended up with about 12,000 cartridges before their insurrection began in 1839. Different leaders assaulted different buildings in Paris and took them over. Blanqui took the Hôtel de Ville, which is the city hall, and immediately was fighting the National Guard for control. There are barricades that go up because of this action that these leaders take in private in the working quarters of Paris. There are a couple armories sacked, but immediately they're met with fierce resistance from troops, and by that same evening of the insurrection, the troops had reestablished control. At least 66 rebels are killed, including 5 women and 28 on the government side as well, so 100 people roughly altogether. Ultimately, 700 arrests are going to be made, and Blanqui escapes to go into hiding for about 5 months, but then they find him and they arrest him and track him down. And he spent the rest of the July monarchy in prison. For the next 9 years, he's going to be in prison. His sentence is initially death, but it will later be commuted to life imprisonment. And just after his death sentence in the courtroom, his wife Amélie, 2 weeks after, dies of a maladie de coeur. She dies of a broken heart at the age of 26. Blanqui never remarries, and when he hears the news, he remains motionless for days in his cell and contemplates suicide. And for the rest of his life, he wears black gloves as a sign of his mourning, and pretty much dresses all in black. And because of his long prison time, his skin becomes quite white, and his hair is also going white. And so when he shows up, there's a tremendous drama in his appearance. But while he's in this prison sentence, he's held in the forest of Mont Saint-Michel, where prisoners could not properly sit or stand. Vermin filled their cells, and the temperatures soared in the summer and plummeted in the winter. And he engages in this constant battle with the prison director, and is constantly just sort of pushing back against him. And he writes during this time, quote, "When one is crushed by force, one must of course die when they kill you. But to submit willingly to humiliating measures when one can avoid them by making sacrifices, however great these might be, is a precedent that political prisoners must never establish. You must be uncompromising. You must never concede, compromise. You must always fight." In February of 1840, he and several other of the leaders of the seasons that are in prison with him, they make an attempt at an escape. A friendly lawyer and Blanqui's mother, his loving mother Sophie, who had smuggled in small saws and chisels, and the prisoners had slowly tunneled through the chimneys that separated their rooms and connected all of their rooms. And so they all get to one of their cells one night, and they escape through a cell window. They have a rope made of bed sheets, I think, that they throw out the window, and there's this huge cliff drop that they climb all the way down this rope. But when they get to the bottom of the rope, it's not long enough, and there's still a huge drop. And one of them actually drops off and is pretty badly injured at the bottom, and so the rest of them are kind of stuck on the rope until they're caught. And they are put back into prison, and there's an even stricter regime afterwards. But this kind of stuff starts to make Blanqui's legend grow. He's so uncompromising, he's so idealistic, and he's willing to suffer everything for his ideals. And so people begin to talk about him. They begin to talk about the unforgivable treatment of the prisoners. And in 1844, the conditions of the prison had been so bad that Blanqui begins to die in his cell. And the king that he's fought against, Louis Philippe, pardons him because he doesn't want to make a martyr out of this guy. But Blanqui says, "Nope, I'm staying in the prison because you're not pardoning the rest of my comrades." And a few months later, the prison doctors diagnose him as terminally ill, and the press at this point is taking up his cause and suggesting he should be released. And so in December, he's offered a pardon on health grounds. Again, he says, "Nope, I'm staying here to maintain, quote, complete solidarity with my associates." And this refusal to get out of the situation that he's in that's so horrible further contributes to his growing fame. And by October 1845, he has a partial recovery. He's able to get out of bed for the first time in 20 months. And they transfer him to a prison hospital in a different place. But from the prison hospital in 1846, Blanqui begins, through sending messages through visitors, he is charged with helping to incite bread riots from prison that are broken out in the city. And he's tried. This time he's acquitted and put back in the prison hospital. But he cannot take a hint. He keeps fighting constantly. In 1848, there's a revolution all over Europe, as you know. And he's freed from prison by the revolutionaries, and the monarchy falls, and the barricades go up again. And he shows up in Paris and immediately begins working for the revolution. And as soon as the revolution has created the Second Republic, which has a constitution based on the United States Constitution, Blanqui is immediately a thorn in their side because he wants a more radical government. Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a famous book on the French Revolution and also after a tour of the United States wrote a great book about the United States as well. He wrote down his observations of Blanqui. De Tocqueville, of course, is aristocratic, conservative gentleman, and when he saw Blanqui appear on trial at one point in time in 1848, he wrote this about him. Blanqui's appearance, quote, filled him with disgust and horror. His cheeks were pale and faded, his lips white. He looked ill, evil, foul, with a dirty pallor and the appearance of a moldering corpse. He might have lived in a sewer and just emerged from it. Blanqui becomes the spokesman for the most radical part of the Second Republic. He defends the adoption of a red flag instead of the three-color flag that existed prior. All the compromises offered by the government to conservatives, he opposes. And on the 15th of May, 1848, just a month later, Blanqui participates. This is not exactly how he wants it to go, but he participated in an invasion of the newly elected Constituent Assembly. It's invading Congress, basically. And then there's some infighting about the methods that they're going to use. He doesn't want a coup, but they try to take over the government and start a new government. But troops stay loyal to the Second Republic, and they arrest a bunch of the leaders. Blanqui once again gets away for about 11 days, but then they get him as well. And the Second Republic, while Blanqui is in jail, he's been sentenced to 10 years in 1849. But by the time he goes to prison, the Second Republic has elected as its president Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon I. And Blanqui predicts, of course correctly, that this will not end well for the Republic. In June, after Blanqui has already been arrested and put on trial, or at least his trial has begun, there is a working class revolution to try to push the Second Republic further towards reducing economic inequality and guaranteeing jobs and things like that. And it is brutally crushed by the French government. During this sentence, Blanqui constantly writes from prison, for example, to London, to the Society of Socialists, which involves Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but Marx and Blanqui never make connection. In fact, Blanqui forbids his followers from joining their movement. In 1858, so 9 years after this most recent prison sentence, he's been transferred to several different prisons. There's been several escape attempts. But right before he actually gets out, in 1859, his mother Sophie dies while he's in prison. So he's lost his wife and his mother while he's in prison. And his mother also, right before she dies, has all of his manuscripts burned, I think to try to protect him, but it's a huge loss for Blanqui as well because it was his life's work. But he's released from prison in 1859, but is followed by the police the entire time he's out, and he tries to set up a political paper to criticize Napoleon III, and of course he's almost immediately arrested again. In 1861, Napoleon is invading Mexico and starting the Second Mexican Empire, and Blanqui is back in prison. And in his trial for this most recent sentence, the prosecutor says to him, quote, "This proves that despite 25 years in prison, you have held the same ideas." Blanqui, "Quite so." Prosecutor, "Not only the same ideas, but to see their triumph?" Blanqui, "I shall desire it until death." He is condemned to 4 years in prison once again, and then is in a transfer. He goes to the prison that he first occupied in 1832 in his first jail sentence. By this time, Blanqui has become a legend. Radicals, especially students, would listen to his lectures on revolution and atheism from his jail cell. And he had, of course, by this time become known as the imprisoned one or the incarcerated. And many of his young followers arranged a jailbreak in 1865 and smuggled him across the border to Belgium, where he immediately became a huge critic of Napoleon III again. And Victor Hugo, the author of Les Mis and other famous works, was also in the same situation, exiled as a critic of Napoleon III. Blanqui, like Marx, saw himself as an enemy of the so-called utopian socialists. He said at one point, quote, no one has access to the secret of the future. He believed that the utopian socialists thought of themselves as prophets, and he also used that same critique against Marx. He also wrote from jail in 1868, quote, the duty of a revolutionary is always to struggle no matter what, to struggle to extinction. Blanqui always missed the opportunities, and he, from exile in the late 1860s, he fights against Napoleon. Then Napoleon's defeated by Bismarck in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Germany declares itself a country, and there's a new republic being set up, the Third Republic. But at the same time, there is a working class revolution in Paris, which is called the Paris Commune. And it has, a month of independence where they create laws and they attempt to create a sort of anarchist government in Paris before they're brutally crushed by the French Third Republican government, who has gone to Versailles, and then in what's called the Bloody Week goes into Paris and just goes door to door and kills everyone. And many people, including Marx, thought that the Paris Commune actually could have survived if it had a proper leader. But right before the Paris Commune happens, Blanqui, as soon as the government falls on Napoleon III, is back in Paris trying to do insurrection. And in 1870, he leads a little revolution that takes possession of a bunch of weapons at a fire station in a working class neighborhood. And they're hoping to generate other people's support, but it fails to generate any enthusiasm. And he just keeps up this kind of activity and is arrested basically a day or two before the Paris Commune happens, the revolution that puts Paris independent in need of a leader. And he's arrested, and at one point in time, the Paris Commune government offers to trade all of its hostages, I think they're like 74, just for Blanqui. Just give us Blanqui, we'll trade you all of our hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, if you just give us this leader that we need. But the French government will not trade Blanqui. They know how valuable he would be as a leader. They keep him as a hostage, and the Paris Commune ends up executing many of those hostages. And Blanqui has to watch from prison as the moment that he really had been waiting for comes and goes and is crushed. Most of the commune's leaders are sentenced to transportation. They're sentenced to be exiled to New Caledonia, which is, very far away from France. But Blanqui, because of his health, is kept in Paris. The commune had elected him as leader, even though he wasn't there, but he was never able to occupy the post. And he's sentenced to another long imprisonment. It's initially life in prison. And this is the prison where he's held in. And while he's there, he writes a very strange and interesting book called Eternity Through the Stars. In it, he imagines the existence of something like what we might call a multiverse. And he says that everything that could happen happens somewhere in the universe and is repeated over and over again. Quote, every human being is thus eternal in every second of its existence. What I write now in a cell in the fort of Taureau, I wrote and will write under the same circumstances for all eternity, on a table, with a pen, wearing clothing, and so for all. One after another, all these earths are submerged in renovatory flames, to be reborn there and to fall into them again, the monotonous flowing of an hourglass that eternally turns and empties itself. It is something new that is always old, something old that is always new. End quote. He imagines alternative realities where the English lost at Waterloo and the French defeat the Prussians in 1870. Everything that could happen does happen. But he also says, quote, there is nevertheless a great defect. There is, alas, no progress. These are vulgar repetitions. Everything repeats over and over again, and all our failures are played out over and over again. But he finds a little bit of room for hope because he says none of our defeats are ever permanent either. Quote, never forget that all we could have been here, we are somewhere else. End quote. He's depressed. He believes that his life's work has been a failure, but he argued from very early on in his career that his own happiness was immaterial, that there was a goal, and that anything was worth pursuing that goal. In the 1870s, as Blanqui languished in this prison, a movement began for amnesty for the communards. And they centered this campaign, this movement, on Blanqui himself. And in fact, in an election to the legislature in 1879, Blanqui won an election even though he's still in prison. The government pronounced this election invalid, but they started to see that there was a groundswell of support for him, and he was freed, and immediately begins agitating again, of course. His last moment is as you would expect, a political speech in 1881. He has a stroke in the middle of it and dies a few days later. 200,000 mourners followed his coffin to the cemetery in Paris. Blanqui will become famous later, although for a long time he's forgotten, because Lenin gives him credit for imagining something that Lenin calls the Vanguard Party. But Walter Benjamin, intellectual philosopher during the Nazi period in France, wrote that Blanqui, although he had been forgotten by his time, for half a century at least, his distant thunder had made this century tremble. Even from jail, Blanqui made governments nervous. Benjamin, the same author, wrote at one point in time, he defined catastrophe as having missed the opportunity. And Blanqui certainly missed a lot of his opportunities. But was there ever really an opportunity to make a real democratic social revolution? Every time he tried, Blanqui failed, but he was also uncompromising. He was kind of a jerk. He never was sensible about taking a break from his activities to lay low for a little while, to wait for a better moment. He fought constantly. Would someone of his time period, who was more popular, more broad in their political goals, more likable, more careful and opportunistic, could that person have succeeded? Giuseppe Garibaldi was born 2 years after Blanqui and died 1 year after Blanqui, almost an identical lifetime. And like Blanqui, he spent almost his entire life in revolutionary activity. Garibaldi became political as an 18-year-old. He was on a schooner towards Russia with a shipment of oranges and met a politically active immigrant and member of a secret society called the Young Italy Movement. This society had as its intellectual leader Mazzini, the romantic intellectual nationalist who inspired so many people in the movement for Italian unification, and Italian unification as a liberal republic. through political and social reform, constitutions, etc. Garibaldi, on that trip to Russia, he joined the Society, the Young Italy movement, and took an oath dedicating himself to the struggle to liberate and unify his homeland from Austrian dominance. In fact, in 1833, so he's 19, maybe 18 or 19 here, Garibaldi met Mazzini himself and starts a long relationship that will ultimately break up based on differences that we'll discuss in a second. He also joined the Carbonari Society. This is a secret society of, the name comes from coal burners, but it's kind of like the stonemasons. They're illegal. They meet in secret. They have oaths, and they're together trying to work for United Italy. In 1834, this 19-year-old, just same time as Blanqui is getting in his first street fight, participates in a insurrection in Piedmont. Here's Garibaldi as a younger man. But Piedmont, if you see here the country labeled Piedmont and this island labeled Sardinia, both the same color, these are a country, Piedmont, Sardinia. And so in Piedmont, Garibaldi participates in a riot, basically, and the government comes down hard. A Genoese court sentences him to death, but he's not there. He's already taken off, and this is something that Garibaldi does that Blanqui could not do enough. At least he runs when it's the right time to run, and waits when it's the right time to wait. He takes off, sails to Tunisia, and then ultimately finds his way to Brazil. And at this time, Brazil is fighting a civil war, and there's a certain part of Brazil that's in fighting a war for its own independence, separating from the larger empire of Brazil. And he joins a bunch of, they call them the ragamuffins, and often they're also called gauchos, sort of South American cowboys. And he joins these rebels, and they fight something called the Ragamuffin War, a series of battles based on independence. And while he's in this fight, he meets a young woman named Ana Ribeiro da Silva, who we usually call Anita. And Anita is going to be the great love of his life, and is also going to be the center of a romantic tale that is going to get globally popular. Ultimately, he fights in several of these battles alongside Anita. She's going to fight next to him several times. In 1839, she joins him on his ship, and they fight a couple battles together. This war is settled by a treaty, and they cross the border in the early 1840s into Uruguay. And they move to Montevideo, Uruguay. And for a while, Garibaldi works as a trader and a teacher, basically. They get married while they're there. They'll ultimately have 4 children. And Anita is incredibly skilled on a horse, and she's the one who teaches him how to ride a horse, and also teaches him about the gaucho culture of southern Brazil and Uruguay. And this is, you'll eventually, when you see Garibaldi, he's always wearing this kind of gaucho clothing, red shirt, poncho, sombrero, and this is where that begins. But Anita will also fight while she's pregnant on the battlefield with him. One point, they're in a battle, and she falls off her horse while she's pregnant, has a miscarriage. And that's not the last time she fights pregnant next to him. He ends up taking 1842, taking control of the Uruguayan fleet, and raises an Italian legion, because there's a whole bunch of other, at this point, Italian nationalists, revolutionaries who have left Italy because they've been exiled, and they've come to join Garibaldi here, and he's starting to become famous outside of this place. And his legion there adopts a black flag that represents Italy in mourning, because it has not been allowed to create a country, and a volcano at the center of that black flag, because there is a dormant explosion coming in their homeland. And this is where his followers begin to wear these red shirts. While he's fighting, defending Montevideo against the sort of government forces, he begins to learn how to fight uh, like a guerrilla, right? Guerrilla warfare, and succeeds at winning several battles in 1846. But in 1848, as you know, Italy, several cities in Italy break out in revolution, and so he comes back to Italy, and he comes back with a little army of trained revolutionaries. He offers his services to the king of Piedmont, Sardinia, and this king again is having an industrial revolution. He has a constitutional monarchy, but so he's got some liberal tendencies, but he's worried about Garibaldi. He's becoming famous already. He's concerned that this guy's going to steal his thunder, and so he kind of puts him off. And Garibaldi ends up going south and offering his army to Milan, and fights a couple battles in what's called the First Italian War of Independence. Minor victories. But in 1849, he heads to Rome with his red shirts, and there's a recently proclaimed republic in the middle of the Papal States, the Pope's country. Rome has declared itself a republic, and the Pope is very against this. And Garibaldi goes to help defend Rome against French forces. Napoleon III sends French forces down to sort of put the Pope back in power and to make sure he has control of the Papal States. And he's nearly killed in the siege of Rome, and has several successful battles against the French, but eventually the French just overwhelm them with numerical power. They lay siege to Rome, and inside Rome, the rebels meet to decide their options. They could continue fighting in the streets, they could surrender, or they could retreat to continue the resistance from the mountains. And Garibaldi makes a speech favoring the third option, saying, quote, "Wherever we may be, there will be Rome. The nation is a spiritual thing. It doesn't need to live in these places. It can go with us as we leave." And so they negotiate a truce, and Garibaldi leaves with 4,000 red shirts at that time. But he's hunted over the next months by Austrian, French, Spanish, and troops from Naples, from Neapolitan troops. And he has to flee into the mountains. And by the time he's up in the mountains, he's only got 250 guys left. And Anita, who is carrying their fifth child, died during this retreat into the mountains. And Anita and Garibaldi, their relationship at this point had become an incredibly powerful romantic story, and I'm romantic in the sense of romanticism, right? This is an amazing love story that people across Europe and across the world by this point are beginning to read about in their version of the tabloids, essentially. And so Garibaldi takes off again in 1849. Anita's dead, and he ends up leaving the country, what's not a country yet. Leaving Italy, and he goes to Morocco, he goes to South America, he goes to China, England, and he spends a little bit of time living in New York, which will really create all kinds of connections for him that will be useful later. In 1854, he comes back to Italy, and he buys half of an island using an inheritance from his brother, and is farming there. But he's basically waiting for this independence movement to break out again. In 1859, the Second Italian War of Independence breaks out, and he immediately creates an army and begins to sort of move upwards from the bottom of the boot of Italy, basically upwards into the central peninsula. And here's an important moment for Garibaldi. As he's marching up through Italy, Victor Emmanuel, the king of Piedmont, Sardinia, the king of this industrialized state, is conquering regions to the north. So Garibaldi has this popular movement where people want democratic representation, They want sort of a broad franchise, and he's heading up with his kind of ragtag army they called the Thousand, or the Red Shirts. And Victor Emmanuel, the king of Italy, of Piedmont, Sardinia, is marching south and really, able to use railroad and machine guns and things like that. And everyone begins to wonder what's going to happen when these two meet. Garibaldi's conquering all of these areas in the south, and Victor Emmanuel is conquering these areas in the north. And when they meet, this incredibly important moment in Italian history in 1860, they meet on this bridge. Garibaldi effectively, it's hard to know exactly what happened here and when they planned it, but Garibaldi basically gives all of his conquered territories to the king of Piedmont, Sardinia. And the territories that they've consolidated together become the state of Italy. It takes a little bit more time to add places like Venice to what's becoming the state of Italy, but ultimately Piedmont, Sardinia is going to lead Italy in this first phase. You can see in this cartoon here that contemporaries, many of them felt that Garibaldi had betrayed the bottom-up conception, democratic conception of the nation as composed of its people equally, and instead had capitulated, had surrendered to the strong industrial state. One historian writes, "The once Republican Garibaldi placed national interests over political or constitutional principle. He decided that unification could be achieved, but only with the help of this industrial state." So Italy, like Germany and like the United States in the same time period, is coming together as a nation, but it's also coming together in a way that is more top-down than bottom-up. Garibaldi goes back to his farm on the island that he owns, and in 1861, he's actually asked by the Lincoln administration to become a general for the Union during the Civil War. And he had, said several things previously which suggested he would be interested in this. But when an ambassador came from the United States to meet with Garibaldi on his island, let me describe this meeting with a quote. "Garibaldi made it clear that the offer to serve with the Union was conditional. Not only did he want full command of the U.S. forces, he also wanted assurances that the Union was fighting to end slavery. An ardent abolitionist dating back to his days as a South American guerrilla fighter, Garibaldi was insistent that emancipation of the slaves be central to any conflict with the Confederacy. Without it, he told the ambassador, the war would appear to be like any civil war in which the world at large could have little interest or sympathy. Nothing distinguishes the Union's cause unless it is slavery." But the Emancipation Proclamation is still a year in the future at this point, and so he could not tell Garibaldi that slavery would be central to the Union's cause, and he certainly couldn't give him anything beyond a commission as a major general with an independent command, and so he left without succeeding. To summarize Garibaldi's effect on Italian history, after Anita died, he was dating baronesses and countesses from all over the world, and women were competing for locks of his hair. People left their wealthy husbands for him. He was a sort of international man of mystery. Russian peasants carried his icon. Balkan revolutionaries waited for him to lead them. And in Italy, there are streets, piazzas, and buildings that bear his name. In England, he was the inspiration for a football uniform, and more importantly, a biscuit, says one author, a cookie. And his love life is quite dramatic and turbulent, and everyone ate this stuff up. He had a one-day marriage where he, I think it was his third marriage, and he found out the night of their marriage that his new wife was pregnant with another man's baby. He divorced her. So his personal life was exciting and interesting to people all over the country, all over the world, I should say. But more importantly, another historian sums it up this way, quote, Garibaldi's popularity, his skill at rousing the common people, and his military exploits are all credited with making the unification of Italy possible. He also served as a global exemplar of mid-19th century revolutionary nationalism and liberalism. But following the liberation of southern Italy from the Neapolitan monarchy, from the monarchy of Naples, Garibaldi chose to sacrifice his liberal republican principles for the sake of unification. I've seen several people make the case that Garibaldi was the most famous man during his lifetime in the world. And his legend, grows over time. It's in some ways you can still find statues of Garibaldi and streets named after him. And when he visited England at one point, I think this is in the 1850s, he made a speech to the iron workers there that gives you a sense of one of the things that makes him so popular. Quote, the progress of humanity seems to have come to a halt, and you with your superior intelligence will know why. The reason is that the world lacks a nation which possesses true leadership. Such leadership, of course, is required not to dominate other peoples, but to lead them along the path of duty, to lead them toward brotherhood of nations, where all the barriers erected by egoism will be destroyed. We need the kind of leadership which, in the true tradition of medieval chivalry, would devote itself to redressing wrongs, supporting the weak, sacrificing momentary gains and material advantage for the much finer and more satisfying achievement of relieving the suffering of our fellow men. We need a nation courageous enough to give us a lead in this direction. It would rally to its cause all those who are suffering wrong or who aspire to a better life, and all those who are now enduring foreign oppression. This role of world leadership, left vacant as things are today, might well be occupied by the German nation. Let us hope that in the center of Europe you can then make a unified nation out of your 50 millions. All of the rest of the world will eagerly and joyfully follow you. Obviously, this is Germany, not England. But he's a part of German unification as well, because of speeches like this. You can hear the romantic nationalism as a part of his words. But despite being one of the most famous people in the world in the 1860s, even though A.J.P. Taylor, great historian, can argue and believe that this is the one wholly admirable figure in world history, which is, of course, a grand statement that not everyone would agree with. Despite being charming, willing to compromise, loved by all, respected by many, ultimately, the nationalism of Garibaldi only worked when it supported the increased centralized power of the modern state, and it failed when it was in service of democratic bottom-up ideals. This trend is, of course, much truer today, where a career like those of Blanqui and Garibaldi today is unthinkable. We don't have revolutions in the industrial world anymore. And in fact, the great sort of rebels of recent history are people like Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, or Edward Snowden, who leaked the NSA spying programs. That's about as revolutionary an activity as you can get. And Snowden is only out of prison today because he fled to Russia. Resisting the modern industrial centralized state is almost unthinkable in the time in which we live. And that process really starts